Hello, scholars. This is the professor speaking, and I welcome you to Hi, That's Scary, a podcast that utilizes cannabis to analyze horror cinema. The title of today's lecture is How Mental Illness Impacts Human Reaction to Fear, Part 2. Today we are returning to our discussion of 13 Ghosts. If you had not listened to How Mental Illness Impacts Human Reactions to Fear, Part 1, please pause and do so before you continue. Last lecture, we finished on Arthur convincing Dennis to aid him in finding his son. Dennis had agreed only because Arthur offered to pay him the money he was rightfully owed. Once the deal was made, Dennis pushed ahead to lead the way down to the basement. In the basement, Bobby awakens from his wall collision. A voice, a ghost, is speaking to him. It's telling him to get up and leave, to put on the glasses and go upstairs. For once in his life, Bobby listens. With the glasses on, he sees the ghost that had been talking to him. Jean, the withered lover, stood before him, partially burned and in a hospital gown. Bobby slowly backs away from her, eventually hitting another wall. Jean attempts to warn him before Bobby is snatched to no avail. The glasses fall to the ground. Cyrus has gotten Bobby. Once downstairs, the group split into pairs, much to Dennis's reluctance. Dennis and Maggie make their way through the halls of the basement. Dennis continues to try to convince Maggie that ghosts are real. He gives her his glasses, and she says that she doesn't see anything. Dennis notices one of the cubes is open and requests his glasses back. He turns from the empty cube to the one across from it. Suddenly, a hammer, a tall man riddled with railroad spikes, appears, striking the glass. Dennis flies back, angrily yelling. When Maggie questions him, he gives her the glasses to see for herself. She's shocked to see the ghost in front of her. Dennis is so smugly happy about this, and you know what? He deserves to be. All night, he's been the human embodiment of, "Why are you booing me? I'm right." He explains that due to Hammer dying violently, all he knows is violence. Hammer begins to remove one of the spikes from his ghost flesh. Maggie asks what he's doing, to which Dennis reminds her that he needs the glasses to be able to see what was going on. Right as Dennis puts on the glasses, Hammer stabs the spike at the glass. Dennis yells again, and Maggie pushes him down the hall to leave. Dennis tells her not to touch him as he turns back to flip off the ghost. Hammer, in return, flashes images to Dennis. They're of himself, bloody and on the floor. He leaves confused. As they continue on their way, they pass a particular box. Dennis sees the box is open and begins to lose his shit. The jackal has been released, and Dennis wants to get the fuck up out of Dodge. They begin to make their way towards the exit when the firstborn son, a little boy with an arrow jutting out of his forehead, appears before them. Dennis then tells Maggie that they had accidentally wandered into the area where the ghosts are free. The way he does this, though, glorious. The line itself, "Somehow we got behind enemy lines." Choice dialogue right there. The tone, shock, and fear, and a dash of resignation. I felt that. Brilliant. Fuck yes. Love it. Dennis puts himself in between Maggie and the ghost before they run from him. Dennis yells for Maggie to stop as she almost runs right into the angry princess. Obviously, as Maggie can't see the ghost, she has an attitude with Dennis. And I don't blame her. He was sassy to her about not being able to see the ghost without glasses, so she's just dishing it back. I see nothing wrong here. Dennis gets a little butthurt about it and begins to annoyedly direct Maggie away from the ghost. His tone quickly switched to panic as the angry princess advanced and swiped her knife at Maggie. As Dennis and Maggie are having their fun, Kathy and Arthur are in search of Bobby. They stumble upon the fallen tape recorder and ghost glasses on the ground. Arthur plays the tape and hears Bobby's screams for him. They continue on their search, Kathy looking over the glasses as they walk. She ponders aloud if Dennis might have been telling the truth. Arthur turns and has this condescending tone and tells her to think of what she's saying, which, rude. As he walks away, Kathy decides to put on the glasses. Standing directly in front of her is the Jackal, a man in an open, ratty straitjacket with his head in a broken cage. His face similar to that of, in my opinion, Reagan from The Exorcist. Utterly terrifying. He pounces on Kathy and drags her down the hall. She screams and Arthur turns to see his daughter just flying down the hallway. He runs toward them. Kathy and Jackal reach the end of the hallway where he places her in the air against the wall so that he could scratch at her body, ripping her clothes. Arthur comes and grabs her legs, frantically asking what and where the attacker is. The Jackal and Arthur end up in a tug-of-war over Kathy. Thankfully, Kalina swoops in and throws a flare at Jackal to get him to release the girl. Arthur tries to question her, but she yells at him to pull Kathy as she was still down on the floor and her leg in Arthur's hand. They didn't have time to get her standing. So Kalina and Arthur drag Kathy down the hallways as the Jackal chases not far behind. Eventually, with impeccable timing, they pass a section of glass that is timed to shift. The Jackal gets caught behind a wall. Arthur gives Kathy his coat to cover up with as she cries into his chest. He then goes to angrily question Kalina, wanting to know who she was and what attacked his daughter. Kalina attempts to explain who she is and her profession before Arthur cuts her off. He's all ornery at the ghost talk. Kathy, having calmed down, looks up to see the Jackal behind the glass barrier, who jumps at her. She screams and shuffles behind Arthur. Kalina orders her to give Arthur her glasses. Arthur puts them on and is absolutely shook to see what was that? A damn ghost. Kalina treats us to some exposition, explaining how there's this book that is in her possession that has instructions in it to build this machine that can see in the future. Cyrus built the machine into his house. This machine is powered by ghosts, which is, really fucked up. That is a shitty thing to do to a soul that's just trapped in this realm. Just like other fossil fuels, there has to be an alternative to using dead, non-consenting people to juice Cyrus's industrial-sized crystal ball. Arthur, on his default angry setting, spits out that he doesn't care that he's in a house that Kalina literally describes as built by the devil and powered by the dead, which would be a dope album name, but regardless, it's terrifying. All Arthur is focusing on is finding his kids, and that's totally fine. But maybe he should care a little more about his 5-year-old not only being lost, but lost in a haunted demon ghost machine. I don't know, maybe it's just me. Kalina, with a spicy bit of pettiness, tells Arthur she won't help him look for his kid unless he helps her first. Arthur goes to check on Kathy and sees that she, too, is missing now. Arthur rushes to the end of the hall, Kalina following behind. She tells him they need to leave, and when he refuses to do so, she points out the firstborn son, standing on the wall and looking at them. They flee as the ghost smirks at them. Dennis and Maggie are walking through the hallways when they spot the stairs. As they try to run for them, the walls begin to move. The wall on their left starting to press inward. Maggie turns to run, not wanting to be crushed by the walls, and collides with Dennis. The glasses drop from his face. Dennis bends to pick them up and then throws them to Maggie, who narrowly avoided getting crushed. Dennis manages not to get crushed, but pushed into a new box by the wall. Dennis is very much finding this not so fuego. And it's only going to get worse. Dennis starts getting flashes of ghosts and doubles over. Maggie puts on the glasses to see that Dennis is trapped in the box with the torn prints, a teenager wearing a Letterman jacket, the skin and clothing on his right side ripped, exposing red flesh. He carries a baseball bat and swings it at Dennis. The ghost gets in a chin shot before Maggie starts trying to direct Dennis from him. She manages to keep Dennis from getting hurt further long enough for the walls to shift again. Dennis tucks and rolls out, narrowly missing getting hit by the bat, the glass swiftly closing behind him. Arthur and Kalina reach a dead end, the stairs mocking them from just a few feet away. Arthur leans against the glass and Kalina tells him to get away from it. When he asks why and she repeats herself, he turns to see Hammer on the other side. The pair back up, horrified. In a flash, Hammer is gone. The jackal replaces him at the end of the hall on Arthur and Kalina's side of the glass. He starts to chase them again before getting stuck behind another wall. Arthur yells at Kalina to figure out where they should go as they're running out of hallways to run into. Looking at the blueprints in her book, Kalina determines they need to go to the library. When Arthur asks where it is, Kalina looks upwards toward the glass floor above them. She starts to climb up to move the piece of glass. Dennis and Maggie manage to make it to and up the stairs safely. Dennis, wearing the glasses, creeps along the hallways, stopping to peer around the corner to check for ghosts. Maggie tells Dennis that she's asking for a raise if they get out of this, and I love Maggie and would all the way want the same if I were in her shoes. However, she did lose track of Bobby, her job, which is why they're in the position they're in now. Maggie was part of the problem. Fuck out of here about a race. Dennis starts to get the painful flashes again. It turns out that's because the great child, a large man in a vomit-covered bib, and the dire mother, a little person, are nearby. As Kalina is pushing the glass floor, Hammer is watching her and Arthur from the other side of the glass down the hall. Dennis and Maggie run from the ghost in front of them to run right into Kalina, who is climbing through the hole with a flare flashing nearby. The pair scream before they realize it wasn't a ghost. Dennis starts questioning Kalina about why she was there. The walls in the house do their thing, and the glass separating Hammer from the hallway slides away. Arthur, naturally, freaks the fuck out and yells for the others to help him up so he didn't have to say hi. Hammer narrowly misses Arthur's legs. The group head to the library, Kalina leading the way and Dennis holding up the back, keeping lookout. Dennis questions how Arthur managed to lose both of his kids in a glass house, which only received a look in response. Dennis then sees flashes before the jackal appears behind Arthur and pounces on him, scratching furiously at his back. Dennis runs to Kalina for the flare and throws it at the jackal, who promptly disappears. Kalina and Maggie pull Arthur to his feet and pull him by his arms to run. Dennis, once again, walks in back, noticing the pilgrimess, a colonial-era woman locked in a stock, coming around the corner. She chases the group until they reach the library, closing the door behind them and locking her out. Now that they're safely in the library, Kalina and Dennis immediately clash. Kalina blames Dennis for their predicament. Dennis points out that Cyrus built the house, to which Kalina reminds him that he helped Cyrus catch the ghosts. She calls him depraved and money-hungry. Dennis agrees with this point before exploding on Kalina, refreshing her on his abilities and his inability to live and in turn work because of what is basically a medical disability. Dennis has fucking seizures when he sees ghosts. All those flashes I mentioned, they were visions, but also many seizures. His voice gets a bit teary when he mentions having to see horrible snippets of people's lives. He tells her Cyrus was his friend and accepted him. Scholars, from what we saw of their relationship, Cyrus treated Dennis like garbage. Dennis's bar for friendship is so low that he considered Cyrus his friend. Kalina laughs and calls him pathetic, which prompts Arthur to tell them to shut up. He then starts to defend Dennis before Kalina drops the bomb. She tells Arthur that Jean is one of the ghosts. Dennis attempts to explain himself, looking genuinely remorseful, telling Arthur he didn't know who they were. Arthur punches him in the face, asking why they took Jean. Dennis tells him that was all Cyrus, and that he'd been trying to help Arthur since he figured out who he was. Arthur echoes Kalina's earlier statement that this was all Dennis's fault, and Dennis curls away from him. Kalina calls to Arthur to tell him how they could free Jean's soul, diving into each of the ghosts, the group of them being called the Black Zodiac, stopping at 12. The house is a machine powered by the ghost to open the Eye of Hell, which is able to see through time and realm. Dennis recalls Damon mentioning a 13th ghost. Kalina claims the 13th ghost is a way to stop the machine, as the 13th ghost is a willing, living person rather than a dead one. Dennis concludes that Arthur is the 13th ghost, which means that if Arthur wants to save his family, he'd have to jump into the machine. Maggie and Dennis are not with this plan at all. Maggie refuses to allow Arthur to do it, as Dennis refuses to believe that the only way out was for Arthur to die. Kalina dumps a bunch of dynamite onto the table as a possible alternative. Dennis tries convincing Arthur not to do it, telling him what he saw when Arthur touched him, which Arthur rebukes. All he cares about are his children. Dennis's face shifts from despaired resignation to determined. He asks Arthur to do one last sweep of the halls for his kids. Arthur confirms Kalina has enough explosives to take out the machine whether or not he jumps, and ensures she has her flare, so they could go search. Maggie objects before Arthur reassures her. Arthur and Dennis carry a glass wall panel as a shield while they search. Kalina and Maggie leave as well in search of the core of the machine. On the way there, they discover half of Ben Moss. They continue on and reach the core, the giant gears in the machine twisting and turning in the middle of the room. Maggie urges Kalina to hurry. A man appears, causing Maggie to scream. She backs away as the man advances on her. She holds the flare up and yells for Kalina, telling her it isn't working. Kalina turns and has this little sly smile. With her heavy demon book, Kalina whops Maggie in the side of her skull, knocking her out. It is then we see that the man is none other than Cyrus. Surprise, surprise. Kalina kisses him, all happy, and this fucker snatches the book from her and then pushes her. He interrogates her, searching for the spells that should have been inside the book. Kalina doesn't understand why he's angry, and she sounds so small in this scene. She pulls out a tape reel and asks if he's mad at her. Cyrus puts on this little smile and says, "Of course not." Gross, manipulative behavior. Arthur and Dennis continue on their mission, searching the halls. Dennis looks deeply uncomfortable. He keeps making what some, like Arthur, call inappropriate quips while they walk along. quips like saying he hoped he didn't bleed to death because it would suck. Funny, yes. Appropriate while in this life or death situation, 50-50. Walls start to move as they walk. A bat touches the floor briefly before the torn prince strikes repeatedly at the glass. Arthur and Dennis hold the glass and, together, smash the ghost into the wall, making him disappear. Dennis and Arthur rest in a corner when Dennis starts getting the flashes. He turns and sees Hammer at the end of the hall. He immediately turns around and wedges the glass panel against the walls, trapping Arthur inside, away from the danger. Dennis presses his back against it to hold it in place as the ghost advances. Arthur protests, trying to get to Dennis. Dennis asks Arthur to let him, because he wanted a reason to like himself, and just looks so scared. As Hammer gets closer, Dennis's expression switches. He lashes out at Hammer, calling him a bitch while he grabs his crotch. And that's perfectly appropriate, because that was a ballsy move, scholars. Dennis dodges Hammer's swing, and the ghost smashes against the glass, pushing it into the walls hard enough to hold it in place. Dennis manages to keep dodging Hammer, but timing is not on his side. The Juggernaut is released. Stunned still by the sight of the worst of the ghosts walking towards him, Dennis doesn't catch Hammer in time. The ghost lands a blow, and then another. Juggernaut reaches Dennis, lifts him, and tosses him around like a rag doll for a little bit, before he snaps him backward over a corner of the house and breaks his spine. Dennis didn't stand a chance. Kalina asks Cyrus what to do about Arthur's reluctance to jump into the machine. Cyrus tells her to put Arthur's children in danger to force his hand. Kalina protests at first, objecting to harming children. Cyrus chastises her and yells at her until she agrees. The fucking flaming garbage barge of a human. Cyrus then starts to play the tape to summon the ghosts. When Kalina returns from her task, Cyrus orders her to grab the book so they can leave. He walks quickly ahead of her. He stops and pulls a lever when she enters the passageway. The lever seals Kalina into the space, and the glass presses in, crushing her to death. Cyrus continues on his way. Juggernaut looks at Arthur, turns, and disappears. Arthur crouches down and actually lets out a wail that ends in an almost yell, the end of it sounding bitten off. Jean appears and slowly approaches him. The two touch their respective sides of the glass. The tape can be heard playing in the background as Jean gets pulled away, Arthur begging her not to go. He allows himself to weep, not cutting off the end of his sobs with angered yells, but just cry. Less than 10 minutes left in the movie is when we get the substantial character development from Arthur, and it's really to his detriment as a likable person. Arthur's triangle of protection happens to be positioned perfectly to see the rings on the floor of the main room begin to rise and fall and rotate all around each other. A platform in the middle rises, bringing up Kathy and Bobby. Arthur pushes down the glass and stands in the doorway of the room, trying to calm down his frightened children. He puts on his glasses to see the ghost standing in a circle, rotating around the edge of the rings. Arthur remembers what Kalina and Dennis told him about the Black Zodiac, and figures out that Cyrus, standing at the end of the hall, is not a ghost. When he does, he charges the other man and shoves him into the wall. Arthur gets in a few hits, but Cyrus overpowers him easily. Cyrus has his villain monologue and sucks up just enough time for Maggie, who is no longer unconscious, to find the sound system and just start fucking with everything. She's sliding switches up and down and eventually just grabs the tape out of the machine. This causes the ghosts to leave their positions and grants Arthur an opening to kick Cyrus backward. Maggie switches her attention to Lucifer's Tinker Toy still spinning about. She pulls on all the levers until the machine starts to fall apart. It's great. Go on, girl. Break it. Now that the ghosts are free from the tape, they grab Cyrus and throw him into the rings where he's sliced into bits. Arthur rises and sees Dennis's ghost leaning against a wall, cleaning his own ghost blood off his ghost glasses, looking all cool. He exchanges some last words with Arthur before telling him to go to his kids. Arthur removes his ghost glasses and walks towards the rings before shuffling backwards for a running start. In the control room, Maggie watches as the machine explodes, sending gears flying through the glass walls. Timing his jump just right, Arthur lands on the platform with his children and shields them with his body from the destruction happening around them. The ghosts walk out into the lawn, all the glass in the house now shattered, and slowly disappear. Dennis soon follows. Jean doesn't leave with the other ghosts, but waits until the rings stop spinning and her family is safe. She gives them one last goodbye before she fades away. Arthur, Kathy, and Bobby hug each other tightly. Maggie, somehow not dead from the explosion, walks through the rubble and screams that she quit. It's time for some conclusion, scholars. Each of the characters has their own distinct personalities, traits, and reactions to fear. Ben Moss, the first character to die, was a typical lawyer. He was arrogant, rude, and uncouth, seemingly having an inflated sense of self-importance. When the angry princess ghosts stab him, his reaction is to anxiously bargain. He's a lawyer, it's what he does. And then he dies. Cyrus is a narcissist, if I've ever seen one. He had negative amounts of empathy for other people. He manipulated people to think he cared about them, namely being Kalina and Dennis. He wants to open the eye of hell so that he can gain knowledge, not just for the sake of having knowledge, but to have power. Most of his dialogue is said with angry or mean tones. He only sounds nice when he's trying to manipulate someone. When the ghosts grab him, all he does is scream and flail. Yes, he's being held by 12 ghosts, but, he doesn't react well under the stress of up-close danger. He doesn't know what to do when he's overpowered, so he just screams like a baby. Kalina exhibits similar behaviors to Ben. Not with the ghosts. She's scared then, but not to the extent that she is when she's with Cyrus. Clearly having been manipulated, Kalina's fear shows in her sadly questioning why Cyrus was doing whatever mean thing to her. Kalina is dealing with domestic violence and brainwashing, so it makes sense that her reaction is to question why, because all she wants is love, and if she knows what went wrong, she can fix it, and she'll be loved again. It's so sad when you really think about it. Maggie is a conflicting character for me. On the surface level, Maggie has the most audience-like reaction to the situation, and that's probably why I like her on the surface. She's used as a comedic relief. When she's paired with Dennis, there's some good chuckles. But I can't really apply this thesis to her simply because of how she's written. We don't get enough of Maggie as a person. All the viewer sees is her being bad at her job, sassy with her boss, and existing only to elevate the other people she's with in the scene. The only time we get to interact with Maggie alone is when she's breaking the machine and quitting. And don't get me started on how all of this is really sticky when you remember Maggie is played by Rodiga, a black woman. If her being the nanny wasn't bad enough, they made her an incompetent nanny. They created a character that is an inept and sassy sidekick that is good at breaking things. That's a big old bag of yikes right there. Both of Arthur's kids should have already been in therapy before the start of this movie, and they damn sure better be after this. They both carry trauma from losing their mother to the fire. Bobby's trauma manifests in an unhealthy obsession with death. It's all he wants to talk about. It's his coping mechanism. He's not well behaved because his nanny sucks and his dad only knows how to yell. When faced with the risk of actually dying, he does what any other scared 5-year-old would do and scream and run away. Just because he's hyper interested in death doesn't mean this 5-year-old wants to join his mom's. Kathy, I also feel, could have been fleshed out better. All the women are so flimsy, and it's very apparent that men wrote this script. There's some hints at issues with parentification with her making breakfast instead of letting Maggie do it because Maggie can't cook, her reminding Arthur to get ready for work, her being the one to scold Bobby when he tells Ben about their mother. She clearly had to assume part of her mom's role, and that's not cool. She's a kid too, and it shows when she's scared. She screams loudly and for long periods. While all the adults have their own sounds, most of them have periods of silent fear, the emotion being portrayed through facial expression. Adults, usually, have the control to not scream too frequently or for extended periods of time. Bobby and Kathy are traumatized children, so they would not have any of that control. Arthur's default setting is annoyed, tipping into anger. After his wife's death, the way his grief manifested was by either being numb or exploding. He gets mad in a snap, frequently using clipped tones and yelling. He's the same way when faced with the ghosts. This is because, for Arthur, his grief is his fear that he walks around with every day. So why would he react much differently when dealing with Cyrus's plot? He wouldn't. He would be his same snarky, condescending, and God is he condescending walking time bomb. I get he's grieving, but that's not an excuse to be an asshole to other people, especially ones that are trying to help him. Maggie, Kalina, Dennis, he's a dick to all of them. He barely talks to Maggie and is hostile whenever Kalina and Dennis start ghost talk, even after he's seen the ghosts. He punches Dennis in the face because his wife is one of the ghosts, which, yeah, justifiable, but until he knew his wife was one of the ghosts, he didn't care about them. He only cares about something when it impacts him. He gets better towards the end of the film, but it takes Dennis whole ass dying in front of him for him to show something other than panicked aggravation. He didn't properly evolve throughout the film, and it makes him dislikable, even though it's easy to understand why he is the way that he is. Arthur uses his anger as a shield to fight every little thing that could hurt him. Now we've reached Dennis. If you couldn't have guessed, scholars, Dennis holds a deep, soft spot in my heart. He's such a multifaceted character. Dennis is constantly experiencing trauma. His ability makes it so he's essentially dealing with a combination of epilepsy, schizophrenia, PTSD, and then outside of his ability, we have some ADHD sprinkled in there. Because there's so much going on in his head, Dennis has multiple reactions to fear depending on the situation. One of his reactions, like Arthur, is anger. Repeated trauma has made Dennis embittered toward the very violent ghosts. He responds with anger when he attempts to explain ghost things and is dismissed because he's afraid of the consequence of them not listening, but also of not being believed. His whole life, he's had to deal with seeing ghosts and people not believing him. It makes sense for Dennis to be angry. But that's not the only way Dennis shows fear. Humor is another one of Dennis's shields, usually following the anger stage. He cracks jokes to hide and as a distraction from his predicament. Hell, if he didn't joke about it, he probably would have just dropped from a heart attack after so many years. When he's not angry or joking around, Dennis is terrified and in despair. He's panicked and pale and sweaty. Just by looking at him, you can see his heart is racing. He flinches when being yelled at, always anticipating some kind of strike, be it physical or emotional. Dennis has a very expressive face. His emotions are easy to read, and it makes it so his feelings of fear come off him in waves. With that, we reach Dennis's last way of expressing fear, and it's the hardest one. Resignation, determination, acceptance. When he tells Arthur that he wanted a reason to like himself, after doing all the things he's had to do in order to survive, and his way of doing that is by letting himself be killed instead, that broke me. All Dennis wanted was to get paid and get everyone out of the house. He's constantly belittled and mocked and blamed for things he shouldn't have been blamed for. Dennis Rafkin deserved so much better. Dennis deserved to get his money and be happy. Yes, he was satisfied in death, but if we're being honest here, Arthur, with his previous behavior, didn't deserve for Dennis to sacrifice himself. Dennis died so that everyone can live. At least now he can rest. Tune in for next week's lecture, where we will be discussing The People Under the Stairs, the 90s gem by Wes Craven. Until then, stay scary.